4 years ago, the Jokin Electoral College elected its oldest squatter to date. In the coming weeks, the 74-year-old morbidly obese 45 and 77-year-old Biden, the 77-year-old Joe Biden, the former vice president and now Democratic nominee, will face off after a Democratic primary in which the other top contenders were 78-year-old Senator Bernie Sanders and 70-year-old Senator Elizabeth Warren. The grain ballot has led many to suggest that the stress of the presidency is not for anybody for the aged people, or that it might be time to cap off the age of future candidates. But we wouldn't pin down the one aspect of this thorny issue. But we couldn't pin down basically the one aspect of this thorny issue that would matter most to voters. With longer lifespans and improved health among older Americans, is it true? Is it true that age affects a squatter's performance? And could an old president ever represent the interest of the young people? So Vox, so the people, so the company, so this news organization Vox decided to send experts out and ask people on opposing ends of the age spectrum, and one specializing in the elderly and the other the politics of the young, to answer this question: how old should a president be before when they decide to run for office? Ultimately, the question elicits no easy answer, but in asking the writers to tackle the idea, we can better understand how age affects and intersects with the most powerful role in our nation. Lately, it's been hard to ignore the unbearable oldness of American politics. You have 45, the country's oldest squatter, and who's morbidly obese at 74 years old. And 45 was born the year that the bikini was invented. Joe Biden, a 77-year-old Democratic nominee, is older than the microwave. Bernie Sanders, 79, was born shortly before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the same year you could buy a pack of the year you could first buy a pack of M&Ms, and two of the highest profile women candidates that were running for president, Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren, were born in the 1940s, at least a decade before the girls started to play with the Barbie dolls. The grain of the American presidency is especially notable because our nation's most visionary presidents have typically been young, like Theodore Roosevelt, who became the youngest president at 42 until Kennedy was inaugurated. Was two of the youngest ones, and they had the foresight to preserve roughly 230 million acres of public land for future generations to enjoy. John F. Kennedy, inaugurated at 43, with the cry that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, found some common cause with the civil rights movement and vowed to put a man on the moon, and started the Peace Corps to spread American values via the American young people around the world. Barack Obama became president when he was only 46 and shielded what they call young undocumented immigrants from deportation and committed to the Paris Climate Agreement aimed at preserving the planet for future generations. And the youngest presidents tended to think more clearly about policies that would benefit future generations and were less circumscribed by long-standing norms and prejudices. Even famous presidents who seemed like great men of history would have been considered young, like the fresh faces in our current climate. Abraham Lincoln was in his early 50s when he was president during the Civil War, and which was younger than Kamala Harris. Franklin Roosevelt was 51, the same age as Cory Booker when he started implementing a New Deal to pull America out of the Great Depression. One of those New Deal initiatives was the National Youth Administration, which provided work study for young Americans who were out of a job. The Texas division of the NYA was led by a young Lyndon Johnson, who years later would take the oath of office at 55, and he had already created the Medicare and Medicaid as part of his Great Society by the time he was Amy Klobuchar's age. Young, glamorous candidates have typically fared better in general elections, but the votes don't always break down according to age. The idea of the youth age, the idea of the youth votes is actually relatively new, and these young presidents weren't necessarily defined by their support from young voters until the early 2000s. Young people tended to vote roughly the same way as their parents did. Even the baby boomers, although slightly more democratic than their parents, they favored Richard Nixon in '68 and Ronald Reagan in 1980. In fact, Barack Obama was the first president to owe his divisive victory to youth enthusiasm. After a series of youth quakes in the primaries helped Obama beat Clinton, and a massive mobilization of college students and young people, two-thirds of voters under the age of 30 chose Obama over John McCain in 2008. Young voters tend to connect with big, bold ideals for America's future rather than policies that seem stuck in the past. So it's no surprise that our current presidential contenders, both who are in their 70s, have struggled to connect with the young Americans. Both, and this is roughly two-thirds of people between the ages of 18 to 29 disapprove of 45, according to a Harvard Institute of Politics study that has tracked youth attitudes across his squad and see, and it's not hard to see why, from withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement and to threatening protections for young immigrants to weakening student debt oversight. 45's policies have favored his older base over the next generation of Americans, and young voters' attraction, too big, too big, bold ideas doesn't always lead young voters to vote to young candidates. And while Biden has actively tried to reach out to young voters who favored his more progressive opponent, he struggled to build what they call a youth enthusiasm around the message that is more about a return to a gentler past than a vision of a bold new future. Young voters' attractions to big to the okay like and also, but young voters' attractions to big bold ideas doesn't always lead young voters to young candidates either. In 2020, they actually favored the oldest contender at that time, Bernie Sanders, and remained cool to millennial Pete Buttigieg. Yet, Sanders' 2020 bid failed, in part because he based his electoral strategy on a massive surge in youth turnout that didn't materialize as much as his campaign expected. But basically, getting the youth support is important, but without a massive turnout, it can't deliver a win. And the generational change is almost always more complicated than it appears. Of course, medical and lifestyle advances like the decline of smoking have meant that people in their 60s and 70s are likely healthier and they stick around longer than people the same age in earlier eras. Still, the U.S. leadership is trending old, not because voters favor older leaders, but because the system protects incumbents and because the campaign finance system makes it harder than ever to raise the money necessary to unseat a sitting leader. It's no secret that millennials are worse off financially than their parents were at that age due to the coronavirus pandemic, and the Gen Z is likely to be similarly strapped for cash. At the same time, the infusion of corporate money into political races has made running for office exorbitantly expensive. By the early 2010s, the average House of Representatives race cost about $1.5 million, roughly double what it cost to run when boomers were first entering the political arena in the early 1980s. Even the average state legislative race cost about $80,000. In other words, politics got more expensive at the exact moment when the rising generation of young people were most financially strapped. If millennials couldn't afford to buy a home or a car, how could they mount a bid for Congress? If they can't run for Congress, how could they ever run for a Senate or run for a Senate seat or become president? Without a new generation of leaders breathing down their necks, the established leaders are simply sticking around and aging in place. And if America can't build a bench of young political talent willing and able to step into the arena, then there may be nobody left to replace them. Um, it's coming close to November, and we'll have two candidates facing off. If they're not geezers, they're geezer adjacent. Should we be worried? Um, a a president's schedule requires fortitude, patience, and intense concentration. Typical day includes a series of high-level meetings and events, including briefings by cabinet members and White House staff, meetings with congressional and foreign leaders, and delivering remarks at various press events. There are official visits to important allied countries, international meetings such as the United Nations General Assembly each fall, and political events in key states. The president signs or vetoes any legislation, but is also the chief executive of the largest employer in the U.S. They're also a diplomat and a commander-in-chief of the armed forces. It's a grueling job physically and cognitively, and it's natural to question whether there's an upper age limit on meeting such demands. Looking at the health of all the former presidents we've had, it doesn't necessarily provide any answers. Our presidents have ranged widely in age, and age hasn't always correlated with mental and physical fitness. George W. Bush, who was 54 at the age of his who was 54 at the time of his inauguration, was 62 when he left office and was up at 5:15 each morning and in bed by 9 p.m. each night. But Bill Clinton, one of the younger presidents at age just 46 when he was elected, had a quadruple bypass operation on his heart just 3 years after leaving office. Um, Our oldest president before 45, Ronald Reagan, was elected at 69 years old and was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 4 years after he left office. It is true that our brains slow down with every decade after 60, but slow isn't necessarily bad. Our slow, deliberate cognitions tend to be more accurate than snap judgments. And although our brains shrink with age, size isn't everything. If it were true, then there would be no smart children, and people with enormous heads would be smarter than everyone else, and they aren't. Although the societal narrative is that we tend to lose mental ability as we age, some brain functions actually improve. For example, we see positive changes in mood and outlook, which and also they're punctuated by the exceptional benefits of experience. Many older minds can intuitively synthesize a life of information and make smarter decisions based on decades of learning from their mistakes. Not every older adult, of course. We can all think of exceptions. The aging brain changes thanks to neuroplasticity. It changes itself, heals itself, and finds other ways to do things. Abstract reasoning can actually improve. But the older people aren't as fast, perhaps at mental calculations and recalling names, but they tend to be much better and faster at seeing a bigger picture. To cognitive scientists like anybody, wisdom is the ability to see patterns where others don't see them, and to extract common points from prior experience and use those to make predictions about what is likely to happen next. Oldsters aren't as fast, perhaps, at mental calculations and recalling names. But like I said, they tend to see bigger pictures, and that results from the accumulated set of things we've seen and experienced, and what we call crystallized intelligence naturally. The more you've experienced, the more of this type of intelligence you're able to tap into. It's also important not to just focus much on how many birthdays a person has had. Some people remain vigorous even well past the age of 80. Just look at Julia Hawkins, a now 104-year-old competitive runner who took home 2 gold medals in the senior games last year, or Ubi Blake, the late ragtime composer and pianist who in 1979 turned in one of his most delightful performances on Saturday Night Live at the age of 92. Neuroscientist Brenda Milner remains an influential researcher at age 101, and the Dalai Lama, who's 84, just recently published his 125th book. A big part of how well one's mental capacities fare at any age revolves around healthy practices concerning sleep, diet, and exercise, and these become particularly important after the age of 65. But they aren't always easy for a busy president to accomplish. Good diet and exercise help us sleep, allowing us to consolidate and strengthen memories. It's a myth that older adults need less sleep than younger adults, but one night of disrupted sleep can lead to memory difficulties for up to 2 weeks. We can ask the Dalai Lama the key to his productivity and energy, and without missing a beat, he says that he sleeps 9 hours a night. On CBS during that morning in January, we had proposed that we should find a term that's less emotionally laden than the older people. I suggested we try oldsters because it sounds like youngsters and hipsters. But 65-year-old Gayle King wasn't having it, and so to Gayle and the rest of the country. How's this? Perhaps older adults should destigmatize and proudly take back the word geezer. Our next president is likely to either start out as a geezer or become one in office, but instead of associating an older president with cognitive limitations, we should be looking at the science, which suggests that an aging mind might be better at making the big picture decisions, or due to age-related increases in empathy and compassion, and be skilled at bringing people together. We've had great presidents and not so great ones, but the idea that age is correlated to the performance is simply not true. Ultimately, aging varies so much from person to person that the number of birthdays you've had doesn't say much about who you are. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Ryan Van Wyk, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.